You say it's the rumor over the weekend. I'd say it's the rumor over the last month, to the point where I addressed it in a column on Friday or last Friday on Sportsnet. And it's always our end game to keep things to roughly 800 to 1,000 words. It was tough in that one because you really wanted to explain all the different things that go into that, not just from Montreal's end, but also from Columbus's. Start with Columbus. They have the player. He's under contract for 2 years at $5 million, which is a really good number. And regardless of the fact that he doesn't want to be there or that it's been reported he wants to be in Montreal, that's his place of preference. Jarmo Kekalainen is under absolutely no rush to get this done. He's likely to come out the loser in any deal he makes, where he's giving up a 22-year-old 6'3" centerman who has already proven something, but also still has a ceiling above him. And he just needs to lose as little as possible, or perhaps end up in one of those anomaly situations like Joe Sakic found himself with Matt Duchene, where everybody thought he'd lose that deal, and, well, he ended up the big winner. So, Montreal's end of it is obvious. Over 3 decades, they've looked for this profile of centerman, and Marc Bergevin for 9 years has been talking about how they're never available, and now one is, and he speaks the language and is a guy that's willing to come to Montreal, at least according to reports that are out there. But Marc Bergevin also, as I led my column, it's like when you're looking for a job and nothing's available and you can't find anything, and then finally you land a job and then 6 other opportunities flood into your inbox. It's one of those things. He's got Nick Suzuki and Jesperi Kotkaniemi. He's in a great situation cap-wise with those 2 players on entry-level contracts. One in Kotkaniemi that could develop as he's a 20-year-old right now, but in 2 years from now, he could look like what Pierre-Luc Dubois looks like at 22. He's got Suzuki, who plays that two-way mold game. He's not as established as Dubois, but he looks to be headed in that direction that much quicker than anybody thought he'd get there. So those have to be the pieces that, if you're Jarmo Kekalainen, you're not making a deal with Montreal unless one of those 2 guys is involved, because there's other teams out there that would want a player like Pierre-Luc Dubois, and they have things to offer.
So I love Pierre-Luc Dubois as a player too. And like I was saying during the Columbus series, I think it was even after game 1, I'm like, wow, this guy's a problem. And sure enough, the Leafs had a very difficult time handling him. But like you said, Kekalainen is under no stress, no pressure to trade this player, which is, I think it makes more sense when you put it that way, that the rumor was out there that they're asking for Nick Suzuki. Because to me, you have to be on some kind of extraordinarily powerful psychedelics to think the Montreal Canadiens are trading Nick Suzuki. They're not seriously entertaining offers on that kid, right?
No, of course not. It's not their angle. It's not what they're looking to do. And but the other side of it is, any discussion about Pierre-Luc Dubois has to start with the question, and related to the Canadiens, do the Canadiens feel they have a better chance of winning now with Pierre-Luc Dubois at a $5 million cap hit this year and next year? And then you weigh how much better do they believe that chance is if they're really considering making this move, and how much better is it if it's Nick Suzuki and not Jesperi Kotkaniemi in the deal. And I think the net gain there is not high enough to take the risk of what we haven't discussed yet, which is the whole quarantine issue. If you make a trade, you're going to be missing a player that you're trading away for 14 days, as well as the guy that you're bringing in, right? So what if the reason you're bringing in Pierre-Luc Dubois and willing to trade Nick Suzuki, I'm not saying they're willing to do that, but what if the reason is that you believe it gives you a better chance to win now, and then you're putting your playoff hopes in jeopardy, and boy, you burned the one of the 2 years you get Dubois at $5 million, because after 2 years he becomes, if he continues on this path, an $8-9 million player. There's so much risk involved, and there's so much that needs to line up on both sides of this that, I think we can all agree it's most likely something, if it does happen, happens in the offseason. And even then, it's a tough call. For me, Nick Suzuki is probably a non-starter, because even if I think Pierre-Luc Dubois is more established and is a different profile player to begin with, but he's a better player, even if I believe that, I don't know that it's that much of a difference that gives you the opportunity to win. Whereas Jesperi Kotkaniemi, if I was Marc Bergevin and I believe in Jesperi Kotkaniemi. I believe that in 2 years from now, he could very much be a player that is like Dubois, but it will take him that amount of time to get there. But if Jarmo Kekalainen called me tomorrow and said I would take a package that revolves around Kotkaniemi, I would consider taking that risk to have Suzuki and Dubois. And if for whatever reason that risk gets in the way of what happens this year, I know that for next year and for 10 years to come, my top two centers are Suzuki and Dubois in a division that, if it's not all Canadians, still includes Austin Matthews and John Tavares on one side and, Patrice Bergeron on another. And this is what they're competing against here. So I believe you win up the middle, and I love Jesperi Kotkaniemi as a player, but I also think that if that deal was available to Marc Bergevin right now, it'd be hard for him to say no to it.
Because you look at the division right now, and it's stacked with number one centers. It's Austin Matthews, it's John Tavares, it's Pettersson, it's McDavid, it's Draisaitl. And Montreal, if they're going to compete, that might be the move where they think, hey, it's win now mode. Dubois is going to put us in the company with those teams.
Yeah, and that's the question about the Canadiens this year, right? They don't have those guys. What they do have is a deeper roster than most of the other teams, right? You probably, I would trade, outside of Ottawa, the top two lines of almost every team in Canada to Montreal for their top two. I would, if I was Montreal, I'd rather have the Scheifele's and Laine's and Matthews and Marners of the world. But the Canadiens and their whole group and their four lines and even a fifth line that is better than some fourth lines in Canada, that's the question we need to have answered this year. Is their depth going to prevail over that star power? And in a normal regular season, it probably wouldn't. But in a regular season where the games are going to look more like playoff games as we move along, that tends to really help in the playoffs when you have that ability to roll things over and deal with the exhaustion element, because you can trust that any line that you put on the ice is going to do the job. So that's the most interesting dynamic of the Canadiens versus their rivals this year. I look at it from the other end too. Is like, will the star-powered led teams beat up on the Canadiens because they can't match up with those star elements? And like I wrote after the Canadiens beat the Oilers, the one equalizer here is Carey Price, because he's the superstar.
All right. So I'm looking at. So there was Vegas with the Thomas Tatar trade a couple of years ago, where they gave up far too much for him, and then didn't play him for some reason. But that was a completely separate issue. They just had so many assets that at the time it almost didn't matter. So no one would refer to the Habs' current roster as old. There are parts of it that are old, but it's a young team. Since 2017, they've drafted in the first two rounds 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 times. Do you think Marc Bergevin could potentially be tempted to trade any of those guys outside of Suzuki and Kotkaniemi, just because there's no possible way all 12 of those guys make the team?
Yeah, it's a great point, because only Detroit has made more draft picks in the last 3 years than the Canadiens have had, not just out in the first 3 rounds or whatever. And yeah, they've built up by consensus. If you read the draft analysts and all the people that know much more about that than even I can pretend to, they consider Montreal to have a top 5 kind of prospect pool here. And if not for the elite level prospects that are in the system, guys like Cole Caulfield and Matthias Norlinder and Caden Gooley, for the actual depth of that system. So, and the Canadiens have entered, at least in my mind, but I think you guys would probably agree, watching what they have and what they're building here, that they've entered a kind of window where it can be digestible for them to potentially move some of these future players to get something that helps them now. We're running up I sat down with Marc Bergevin last week and we talked about trade, and he believes, just like he echoed Jim Rutherford's thoughts in Pittsburgh, that it's nearly impossible this year. It's really, that was what made it so important for Bergevin to make so many moves prior to the season, to bring in so many players to the point where he even had to risk losing some good ones on waivers. And the Leafs did similar things, and they also ran up against those risks. And just like Montreal, they've lost Aaron Dell, and Montreal lost Noah Juleson. Neither team wants to lose those players. You bring in the depth for that specific reason that the trades are going to be that much harder to come by this season. So it depends on who the player is that they're after, if they're going to consider moving some of those prospects. But I think there's a willingness on Bergevin's end to do that much more than there has been over the last 3 years.
So when you go to the States, let's say you're traded there, do they have the same quarantine as Canada? No.
Well, and also this is what's so complicated about it. It's that the rules are different from state to state. It's not just a blanket across the states, and same here. Even though we have an applicable rule in Canada regarding people coming in from the States to here, from even Canadian teams to Canadian teams, the local governments have different rules. BC seems to be a bit more stringent than somewhere else. Manitoba is a bit more strict than other places, to the point where they're telling visiting media coming into Manitoba to quarantine for 14 days beforehand. So wow. I don't know if I'll be going to a Winnipeg Jets game this year. So it's just, these are the circumstances we're dealing with. And for as much as you want to stay on top of it as a reporter in terms of what all the semantics are, it's very complicated and requires almost a day-to-day, let me reach out to this person just to make sure I understand this properly. So before I sat down and wrote 1,100 words on Pierre-Luc Dubois on Friday, I wanted to make sure I was right about saying that if he's coming in from Columbus, you got to wait 14 days before he gets integrated into a practice. Because you go back to training camp, guys who were coming in from the States or Europe had to quarantine for 7 days. And then for the next 7, they had to have 4 negative tests in those 7 days. And for the next 7 days, they were allowed to go to the practice rink and home. The reason why it's not the same rule now is because the Canadians are no longer in their own bubble. They're sharing a bubble with the other teams in Canada. Not, an imaginary bubble, but there's other considerations. You can't bring in a player from the States and have him around your group after 7 days and 4 negative tests and play against opposing players if they're exposed to those players. Like it's annoying. It's boring. I don't even keep talking about it, but it's one of those things that I'm trying to give you some insight on how much we have to think about that stuff before we write something or say it on the air and get it wrong.